Our Lady of Sorrows Hospital, Richmond, Virginia. Several hours seemed to come and go without Dana Scully realizing just exactly how much time had in fact passed. At Mark's request, she'd taken on his cousin as her assistant. As an introduction to becoming her right-hand man, as it were, she had taken Naomi through a surgical procedure involving a patient who was having problems with the neck and lower back. Dana had shown her how to perform an anterior cervical fusion, which removed pressure on the nerves in the neck area by removing the discs between the vertebrae that were pressing upon them. She then demonstrated how to fuse the affected vertebrae together by connecting them with metal plates and placing a piece of bone between them, explaining that this would keep the vertebrae from crushing the nerve again, and eventually the added bone would fuse the vertebrae into one. Dana had to admit she'd been very impressed with the way the young woman carefully observed every moment during the surgery, and even asked intelligent and well-thought-out questions afterwards. Feeling very satisfied with the new protégée, she had left Naomi to complete a thorough history and physical examination on all the new office patients, prior to presenting each one to her, whereupon she would then help formulate a treatment plan, among other duties. Finally, catching a moment's rest, Dana had retired to her office and was just about to start munching on a sandwich, which would have been the only other thing she'd been able to eat since breakfast, which now seemed eons away. All of a sudden there was a sharp knock on her door. "Oh, please," she said, sighing heavily. Perhaps if she ignored whoever it was, they'd go away and leave her in peace. Nice idea, but unfortunately the professional side of her knew she could not behave in this manner. So, reluctantly returning her sandwich to its cellophane wrapper, she called out, "Come in." Expecting the visitor to be a member of staff, she was completely taken by surprise when the door opened just enough to allow her partner to stick his head through. "Mulder," she exclaimed, "what are you doing here?" "I'm really sorry to bother you, Scully. A nurse said you were in your office, so I presumed you were taking some free time," he asked hopefully. "Free time? And just what was that, pray tell?" "Well, I was," she replied, frowning a little. Then she gestured for him to come in. "Mind if I eat while we talk?" she asked, retrieving her extremely late lunch, or early dinner, depending on which way you chose to define it. Taking a large bite out of the sandwich, mouth now full, she savoured the delicious contents, then added, "Sorry, it's just I haven't eaten since the crack of dawn." Mulder crossed over and sat down opposite her whilst she carried on munching. "Course not," he said. "I haven't eaten either." "Why not?" Scully asked, puzzled. "We've got food in the fridge, and there's always take-out." 9 times out of 10, he'd usually resorted to phoning some fast-food diner whenever he finally admitted he was hungry. "Lost track of time," he admitted feebly. Taking the folder he'd brought with him, he placed it on the desk and removed the papers he'd printed out at their home. Scully shook her head and smiled. "So what's kept you so busy this time?" "A string of old FBI cases dealing with the similar deaths of young women, only they were closed when they shouldn't have been," he said, giving her a timid smile, whilst handing over the information he'd discovered on the internet. Realizing she was more than likely going to rebuke him for looking into such matters, he added, "Scully, I know I can solve these." "Oh, and here I was thinking you found some new porn site to occupy your mind," she said cuttingly. Glancing briefly through pages of typing, she came across an artist's depiction of a haggard old woman with a severe facial disfigurement. Another picture revealed a stick-thin grey woman with a mass of tangled hair. Noticing the wording underneath clearly revealed information about a certain paranormal myth, she sighed heavily. "Bloody Mary, Mulder." He squirmed in his seat but stood his ground. "Those women all died in front of mirrors. Yeah, the coroner's reports gave some very good reasons for suicides, but they didn't account for those whose eyes were encrusted with coagulated blood, almost as if they'd just exploded out of their sockets. Plus, amongst those victims, they found no weapons. How do you explain that?" Mulder asked, shrugging his shoulders. Scully really didn't have time for this, but thought she'd better attempt to give him some sort of an answer. Perhaps he would accept a logical explanation just this once and cease bothering her. The chances of that happening were remote, and she knew it, but decided to give a theory anyway. It could have been a freak medical condition, maybe an aneurysm, or perhaps a stroke was the cause. Mulder snorted with derision. "Should have realized you'd come up with a scientific explanation, even if you can't completely justify it," he said, sounding a little annoyed. "After all we went through in the past, including the unexplained phenomena that we actually witnessed, and yet you still turn to your fucking medical science for the answers." Well, what do you expect? Scully retorted, now angry by his unexpected outburst. I'm a doctor, Mulder. You know that's my position in life now. I want absolutely nothing more to do with the supernatural, and I also remember telling you this after our last encounter. She shuddered as images came into her mind of the ex-priest and his so-called psychic connections that had led them to a perverse experiment involving the removing of a man's head whilst he was still being kept alive. A group of men had been planning to surgically attach it to a woman's body, which they would also have beheaded whilst the poor girl was still breathing, if she and Skinner hadn't stopped them in time. Mulder sat back heavily in the chair. If I recall, most of that last encounter showed us how science is capable of reaching some pretty sick achievements. All man's doing, I believe, not mythical monsters or any other paranormal creature, he answered defiantly. Even a two-headed dog was created by genetic experiments. Scully calmed a little, knowing he was right in this case. Okay, so you believe these deaths were caused by a witch? She said, showing him the page she was referring to, then proceeded to read some of the text. Mary Worth lived over 100 years and dabbled in the black arts. She was found out and executed. Skipping through several paragraphs, she read, legend has it that if you chant Bloody Mary 3 times in front of a mirror on the stroke of midnight, it will summon her angry spirit who is seeking revenge for the punishment of her death. Giving him a look of anguish, she handed the pages back to him. So do you really expect me to believe that all these women played that children's game when the clock struck 12, and as a result of their foolishness, Mary stole their eyes, huh? Some of them had their throats cut as well, Mulder began, sounding irritated. Look, there is more than one myth that could perhaps relate to these murders. One revealed the spirit of a woman who had originally been murdered in front of her bathroom mirror by her jealous husband. He had cut out her eyes so she could no longer see the hurt and pain she'd caused him, and had also removed her tongue so that she could no longer speak his name. So if you summoned her, you received the same treatment. Really, Scully sighed deeply. She realized he was about to give her a rundown of all the related folklore that had ever been documented, and also knew she wouldn't be able to stop him. So resigning to this fact, she sat back in her chair and continued to finish off her lunch, whilst reluctantly listening to what he had to say. Another possible origin is the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, also known in Hungary as Countess Dracula, who was rumoured to have killed young girls and bathed in their blood to preserve her youthful beauty. Of course, she wasn't named Mary, but it still became related to that myth. So, now we have vampires added to the mix? Scully interrupted. What next? Werewolves, perhaps? She knew her voice had taken on a sarcastic edge and noticed the hurt in his expression. Please, Scully, let me finish, she pleaded. Those sad puppy-dog eyes of his were now boring into her soul, and when that happened there was nothing she could do but wait it out. Sorry, she said apologetically. Please continue. There's also a historical connection, he said, hoping she at least might find this next bit of information interesting. In answer, Scully just nodded her head and rolled her eyes at him. Not to be put off by her obvious disinterest at this point, Mulder continued reading. Mary Tudor became Mary First Queen of England and was given the nickname Bloody Mary when she violently executed and burnt folk at the stake for heresy throughout her 5-year reign. Glancing up at his partner, he could see her eyes were now glazing over. So much for trying to impress her with a piece of historical fact. There's also a modern myth about a local woman who was involved in a fatal car accident, and her face was horribly scarred before she died. She reappears in the mirror when summoned with that same horrific face. He noticed her expression hadn't altered, so added quietly, There's one more explanation I found, but I'm guessing you've heard enough. You guessed correctly, Scully replied, extremely relieved that he'd managed to somehow stop himself from continuing any further with these mundane folklore tales. She then realized he was starting to chew on his bottom lip, which he always did when he either got nervous or irritable, so decided to approach with a tiny white lie. Okay, so there are these fascinating myths about this Bloody Mary, but what has that got to do with these women's murders, if indeed they were even murders? That's what I want to find out, Mulder stated firmly. Scully, you knew who I was during all those years we worked together on the X-Files, before we got anywhere near as close as we are now. I'm sorry, but I can't change who I am. I'm not asking you to do that, she said softly. But after the last incident where I saved you from being killed, I just don't want to have to face anything like that anymore. If you must know, I'd be really glad if you never got mixed up in the paranormal again, but... She paused, knowing the chances of that actually happening were, to put it bluntly, impossible. But however much it pains me to say this, she continued, it wouldn't be fair of me to try and stop you. She regretfully realized she would never be able to completely eradicate the paranormal from her everyday waking life either, not when she also knew the date of this final alien invasion in 2012. However, even now there was a part of her that stubbornly refused to accept this event was going to take place. It was what kept her from falling apart, not accepting the paranormal at face value, unlike her partner who welcomed it with open arms. At least she could put all of her concentration into her work at the hospital until such times arose, if they were going to, but Mulder would continue to thrive on his beliefs until Kingdom Come. Sadly, she knew it was his way of dealing with life as a whole. Mulder let out a long, aggrieved sigh. I seem to remember it was you, Scully, who asked me to help the FBI with that last case. I was very reluctant to do so, but gave in anyway. I know, she replied. But when things got too heavy, I remember asking you to step away, but you wouldn't. Taking hold of her hand, Mulder closed his eyes briefly and then looked straight into her own. No matter what happens, I won't let the darkness come between us, he stated, whilst at the same time wondering if he could one day find the strength to prevent it from entering their lives. Mulder, you can't promise me that, she replied sadly, especially when you continue to pursue it. Scully, you can't expect me to go and get a mind-numbing job in an office. Now that would kill me, he admitted truthfully. She gave him a brief smile. I'm not asking you to do that, Mulder. Then what are you asking? He said, letting go of her hand. I just want you to try, she started to say, but the rest of her words refused to come out. Maybe because she feared if she'd said exactly what was on her mind, he would have refused to listen. It seemed as though they were destined to remain on that never-ending merry-go-round forever. Mulder placed the papers back in his folder. He rose from the chair and proceeded towards the door. I can't let go of this, he said quietly, and then left the room. Scully put both elbows on her desk and resignedly dropped her chin into her hands, closing her eyes as she did so. That's what I was afraid of, she muttered to herself solemnly.